Good evening, everybody, and welcome, and happy Trans Day of Visibility. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into tonight's discussion, a celebration of trans and non-binary narratives in sci-fi, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like those featured tonight, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. And so, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Bishakh Som, Charlie Jane Anders, Neon Yang, Sarah Gailey, Tanika Stotts, and Daniel Lavery for tonight's discussion. Bishakh Som is an Indian-American trans femme visual artist. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, We're Still Here, the first all-trans comic anthology, Beyond, Volume 2, The Strumpet, The Boston Review, Black Warrior Review, Vice, The Brooklyn Rail, BuzzFeed, Ink Brick, The Huffington Post, The Graphic Canon, Volume 3, and Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream. She received the Zurich Grant in 2003 for her comics collection, Angel. Her graphic novel, Apsara Engine, is now out from the Feminist Press, and her graphic memoir, Spellbound, has been published by Street Noise Books. Bishakh has illustrated 2 books about architecture, The Prefab Bathroom, an architectural history published by McFarland Press, and Cocktails and Conversations, Dialogues on Architectural Design, published by AIA New York. You can see her work at www.bishakh.com. Charlie Jane Anders' upcoming novel is Victories Greater Than Death. She's also the author of The City in the Middle of the Night and All the Birds in the Sky, which won the Nebula, Crawford, and Locus Awards, and Choir Boy, which won a Lambda Literary Award, plus a novella called Rock Manning Goes for Broke and a short story collection called 6 Months, 3 Days, 5 Others. Her short fiction has appeared on Tor.com, in Boston Review, Tin House, Conjunctions, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Wired Magazine, Slate, Asimov Science Fiction, Lightspeed, ZYZZYVA, Catamaran Literary Review, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, and tons of anthologies. Her story 6 Months, 3 Days won a Hugo Award, and her story Don't Press Charges and I Won't Sue won a Theodore Sturgeon Award. Neon Yang, they, them, is the author of the Tensorate series of novellas from Tor.com Publishing. These include The Red Threads of Fortune, The Black Tides of Heaven, The Descent of Monsters, and The Ascent to Godhood. Their work has been shortlisted for the Hugo, Nebula, World Fantasy, Lambda Literary, and Locus Awards, while the Tensorate novellas were a Tiptree honoree in 2018. They have over 24 works of short fiction published in venues including Tor.com, Uncanny Magazine, Lightspeed, Clarkesworld, and Strange Horizons. Neon attended the 2013 class of Clarion West and received their MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia in 2016. In previous incarnations, they've been a molecular biologist, a writer for animation, comics, and games, a science communicator, and a journalist for one of Singapore's national papers. Neon is currently based out of Singapore. They are queer and non-binary. Sarah Gailey, they, them, came onto the speculative scene in 2015 and has since become one of the sharpest, funniest voices in pop culture online, going viral frequently for their stories and joie de vivre. They are a regular contributor to multiple websites, including Tor.com, where their Women of Harry Potter series won a Hugo Award for Best Related Work. Gailey's nonfiction has appeared in Mashable and the Boston Globe, and their short fiction in various popular outlets. Tanika Stotts is an Emmy-nominated story editor currently working in animation. Past writing credits include work on Steven Universe Future, Craig of the Creek, and My Little Pony, Pony Life. Before coming to animation, Tanika worked as an editor and publisher for multiple award-winning comic book anthologies, including the 2015 Lambda Literary Award winner, Beyond, the queer sci-fi and fantasy comic anthology, and the 2017 Ignatz winner for Outstanding Anthology, 2018 silver medalist at the Independent Publishers Book Awards, and 2018 Eisner winner for Best Anthology, Elements Fire, a comic anthology by creators of color. The second installment in the Elements series, Elements Earth, is now available on their website. Other work includes Tanika's writing on webcomics such as Casual Hex, Love Circuits, and the Eisner-nominated Deja Brew. Joining our panelists and moderating tonight's conversation is Daniel M. Lavery. Daniel is the author of Something That May Shock and Discredit You and the current Dear Prudence at Slate, the co-creator of The Toast, and writes the Shatner newsletter. Finally, tonight's ASL services have been provided by Pro Bono ASL. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bishakh Som, Charlie Jane Anders, Neon Yang, Sarah Gailey, Tanika Stotts, and Daniel M. Lavery to the stage.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. It's so fabulous to get to be here. Normally, if we were actually all in person, I'd be able to get a slightly better sense of how to get us started. But as it is, I will simply jump into my first question and just say one more time how excited I am to be here with all of you and how much I'm looking forward to this conversation. So feel free to take any of these questions or none, but I wanted to start by asking you all, how do you understand the relationship between your work and science fiction to begin with? And then do you think of your work in terms of having a trans or non-binary narrative specifically, other types of narratives with trans and non-binary characters in them, or something else entirely? And then if you'd like to answer an additional question, what, if anything, do you think distinguishes a trans narrative from a narrative that encompasses trans people?
I'll do it. I'll be the first one
to go first.
So I love this question so much, especially because it draws a distinction between a trans narrative and a work of fiction that has trans people in it. I think of all of my work as being about queerness, and especially about the kind of a sense of discarding binary thinking in any regard. I'm so bored of pairs. And so I really love the notion that, even a story that I write, that I don't disclose anyone's gender origin story or gender superhero identity in, is still part of our growing work of trans and non-binary science fiction. And that's something that I personally hold like a little pearl in the giant cartoon clam of my heart.
I'll go next. It's an interesting question. I think, like Daniel asked, how do I relate my work to science fiction? And honestly, I am a person who constantly tries to write science fiction, and it mostly ends up at science fantasy, because I just can't keep my grubbiness of magic and stuff like that. I tend to write secondary world fiction, and I think the reason why I do it is I like the freedom of having a sandbox aspect of society that I want to, and that includes things with gender. And I tend, how I tend to see the difference between like what makes a trans narrative and a narrative that has trans people in it, is that I think like a trans narrative has definitely got something to do with gender or the experience of being trans and like living in trans bodies and how like the society itself deals with that. Whereas the narrative of trans people is just like something happens and it just so happens that the way gender is done in this world is different, or like, you know, there's trans people in it. So that's kind of how I tend to separate them. I don't know if people agree or disagree with me.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I feel like the kind of cliche is to say that science fiction is all about like what it means to be human. And I feel like, you know, when you're approaching it from like a position of being people whose humanity has been called into question over and over again, you are inevitably going to approach that like big kind of nebulous question differently. And, you know, I kind of find that being a person is weird. Having a body is weird. Living in the world with other bodies and they're kind of imposing all their weird garbage on you is weird. And a lot of my fiction turns out to be trying to kind of worry at that knot of like, how do you be a person and have a body and like exist with other people? And some of my most trans narratives are the ones that don't have any explicitly trans characters, actually. Like, I've lost count of how many people have come up to me and been like, okay, the city in the middle of the night, the main character goes and gets like a surgery that transforms the way that her body interacts with the rest of the world. And she is, you know, she has like a whole different relationship with other people after this. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that might be a trans narrative. I don't know. I mean, you know, and I was thinking about that as I was writing it, but it's, you know, I thought I was being subtle maybe, and people are like, nope, it's right there. So I feel like it's about like how you approach those big science fiction questions from like a different perspective than someone who, you know, might be a cis dude might.
I guess I'll go next. My work's relationship to science fiction. Well, I was born in the 80s, raised in the 90s, and I felt that fantasy was supremely whitewashed and very uninviting while I was growing up. Therefore, I took a different stance in falling in love with science fiction, which then turned out to be just as racist sometimes, unfortunately, and needed to be addressed in a lot of ways. So when I was old enough to hold a pen and really start formulating my ideas of what narratives I wanted to see transform through science fiction, it became Blackness, and Blackness was the core. Me being someone who isn't completely had all of the vocabulary to understand what I see within myself as far as gender or gender nonconforming became fluidity, and that fluidity began to flow throughout my work as well as my characters, be it whatever storyline that I was kind of telling. My default was always Blackness because that's just who I am. So science fiction not having that originally for me when I was looking for it, and then finally discovering it a little bit later on, what did exist, and being able to take those things and teach those things through my own works by giving homages or just character nods or various background settings that might have existed in something else. And I wanted to make it a little bit cooler, but also be like, hey, also go check out this older work, was really important to me. So my relationship with science fiction is actually pretty bread and butter. We're thick as thieves. And I'm very excited to see how it is finally becoming science fiction once again, where it's telling a futuristic narrative that isn't just reliant on old tropes, and it's becoming something so much more different. It is the future. It's futurism all over again. So that's my relationship. And it's on its own borderline of where it lies in conformity, just due to the fact that I myself am a person who's constantly growing and changing, and I don't feel like I need to go down one lane while telling my story.
Thanks so much.
Oh, sorry. I'll just round out the conversation by saying I as much as I love science fiction, you know, it's one of I love science fiction in cinema and in books. I never really thought of myself as being included in the genre, you know. But I'm very honored and thrilled to be embraced within the sort of within the family of science fiction. I know, I don't like my first graphic novel, Apsara Engine, has been called a bunch of things, you know, like speculative fiction, or, you know, like it's been compared to like Black Mirror or something, but like, and I don't know where it falls on any of the like those spectra. But I love science fiction so much, so I'm it makes me happy to be part of this family. Like Charlie Jane was saying, some of my work also, you know, both of my books, Apsara Engine and Spellbound, were written in the course of my coming out as trans, which meant that a lot of the characters in them weren't necessarily trans, but on their way to realizing their transness and fulfilling their queerness, you know? And so I don't know, a lot of I think there's a lot of queerness that's unearthed in my process of having written the two books. And I think reading the two books, you get to witness a process of discovery of what it means to be trans and queer. So I don't know, I'm still trying to figure out what it means to have, to participate in trans narratives. So yeah, work in progress for me.
Thank you all so much. One sort of classic problem that the genre sometimes faces is, I think, something like this. The future is presumed to be more enlightened / gayer / somehow more generally free than the present, but the arrival of that freedom has often taken place in that future's past, which sort of serves to foreclose on thought about how such freedom might be attained and accounted for. Something like, the future is gayer than the present, but the future's problems serve as stand-ins or even euphemisms for the gay problems of the present. Obviously, that's not always a problem for any part of this genre, but it is an interesting one, I think, to contend with. And so to that end, I'm just curious, how do you understand your own work's relationship to futurity? And by the way, I'm sorry, I didn't just want to throw the word futurity in here. It was sort of in the promotional material, so I thought it was worthwhile to engage with it in the questions, but otherwise I would not have chosen a word that I'm not confident in pronouncing to ask you all about.
First, I just want to say that's adorable. I don't mind jumping in, but I would love to hear from everybody else in regards to this, because this is something I've been thinking about deeply for the past 5.5 years, actually, as we've taken over bookstores and have started to change and push LGBTQ plus media throughout. It's constantly evolving, and I feel like this is like the yummy part, because when I asked this question without the word futurity about 5 years ago, and I was just like, where do you think we're going? Everybody was like, I have no idea. I hope it's less racist. And I felt the same way. And it's not just like a structural racism through like, you know, just works that are coming out. It's also the structured racism that's like existed in publishing the whole time, as well as everything else that's been kind of stacked against us. But things are changing now, so I'd rather talk about the positive and really kind of just like let that out, because we're setting the stage for folks who we hope don't have to endure the same levels of measurement and the same gates that we have been refused passage through. And honestly, I don't want to be at anyone's table. I'd flip it if I was there. So I'm really ready to see what type of confidence and what type of action we're all going to bring, especially in mentoring and kind of molding new minds with our works. Anyway, sorry for my excitement.
I'm very into that excitement. I'm like, it's like wafting out of my computer screen at me and making me feel so excited for the future, which is a kind of unfamiliar feeling lately. I always feel hesitant to speak about the whole genre and its relationship with anything, because everyone in the room seems to know so many more angles than I do about everything I try and talk about. So I'll just stick with my own work. But my work's relationship with the future, I'm not going to try. I'll I'm not going to try and say it. My work's relationship with the future is very much grounded in the struggle that comes between now and the gayer, freer, whatever that means, future. My most kind of queer future book is a novella called Upright Women Wanted that is wholly about queer survival and resistance during a period when queer people are in a moment of deep struggle and kind of being forced underground in a way that is not uncommon in the world, but isn't where my country is today. And I think that struggle is so important to center in our conversations about queer futures, because struggle is how we get to better places. And I often worry that the kind of lack of conversation around struggle makes it seem that struggle is failure instead of struggle being survival and growth.
So yeah, for me, that's interesting because okay, for Sarah, I don't think I can speak to like the whole genre as a whole, and I just said whole in the space of 5 seconds. But for me, my work, I tend not to think of in terms of whether this is a future, a futurity thing, whether I'm talking about something that I see as a potential future for us, because my work tends to be set in sort of mythological, not really here nor there settings, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that kind of thing. And I think I tend not to think of things as speculative futures. I think like Taneka, I grew up born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s, watched the world change drastically in the last 20 years because of the advent of technology. So I don't think that I, as this potato who just puts words together and brings up nonsense in my head, I don't think I have tools equipped to actually predict or even speculate about what the future could be, because I know that human society changes a lot very fast, and sometimes we can never predict it. But I like to think of the worlds that I create as sort of like a speculative parallel, in a sense. It's exposure into things that could be but are not, and then I hope that you get people to think, why not? So I don't know if that's considered futurity. In a sense, it's more like looking at what could be, possibly not in the future, but why not right now? Does that make any sense even? But tend to think sideways about these things.
That's so brilliant. It makes so much sense. And it just, I said in an email to everybody here that I knew I was going to be smarter coming out of this panel than I was coming into it. And I'm just devouring how brilliant that is.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Bishakh, you were going to say something.
No, go for it.
Okay. I've been feeling really drawn the last few years to write a lot more hopeful stories about queer communities in the future. And I had one story that's about basically a queer commune living in the drowned ruins of San Francisco after climate change. I have a story about a woman who transitions from male to female on her 100th birthday in this weird cyberpunk future. I've been writing a lot of hopeful trans stories, and I really don't get into how we got from here to there. And now I'm thinking that, that is a thing that we need to think about more, because we are currently facing two alternate futures, one in which am I allowed to say mother, the mothers of disinvention who are passing all of these laws in Arkansas and elsewhere, a future where they win and we are wiped out. That is a possible future right now. There's also a possible future where we win and we get to live and have humanity and purpose and community. And I do think that imagining future communities that support each other and that are healthy and that lift everybody up is part of how I am dealing with living through this really uncertain moment that we're living through. And that kind of is permeating a lot of my work in the last 2 or 3 years. So I don't really have a good answer for that, but I think community and just try to imagine hopeful futures. And I agree with what Sarah said about the struggle being the struggle is hope.
I was going to say I think the most explicitly science fiction comic story that I've done is one that was part of an anthology that Tanika co-edited called the Beyond Volume 2. And my story was one about a gang of future trans South Asian women and the kinds of the kind of existence, the kind of nomadic existence that they have to take on in order to survive. So it's very much grounded in the traumas and realities of the present, right? Because it's their existence is grounded in the kind of wounds of today, and yet there's a utopian aspect to it, to the futurity in the sense that out of that there comes a sort of opening and a kind of opening out into possibilities. There's also a story in Apsara Engine called Swan Dive, which is specifically and very explicitly about trans futures, and the capability of trans imaginations to open up possible futures. It also deals a lot with the power of drawing and the power of art to unlock those kinds of portals into the future. But again, all of that is grounded in the problems and the daily kind of dysfunctional interactions that trans and queer people have to face just to be in the world, right? A lot of that openness and that kind of thinking is predicated on our modes of survival right now. So yeah, it's a futurity which is tethered very much to a present, I think.
Bishakh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'll depart for a moment from my written questions because that brought something up that I have been thinking about a little bit lately, and I'm curious to know if any of you have thoughts on this. Whether or not you think there's something unique about a trans narrative's relationship to time, or the idea of transness as potential relationships to time. Of course, there are multiple ways that could show up in work or in a life, but yeah, the specific possibility of unique trans relationships to time. Just wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that subject.
I was going to say there's going back to the story Swan Dive in Apsara Engine. I'm not sure if this is like a specifically trans way of thinking about time, but what I was thinking of in that story, and it shows up in the way the comic is laid out visually in terms of the page design and the way the characters are interacting on this page, but there's a sense of a kind of kaleidoscopic sense of time, of the simultaneity of different timelines and of different possibilities of different futures all collapsing and overlapping onto each other in the space of a page or a two-page spread of comics. And that is really that was the impetus for me to some degree to write that story, which was to get to draw these two-page spreads that are all about the sense of kaleidoscopic futures.
That's really gorgeous, and I think lines up really beautifully with what Charlie Jane was saying about the kind of timelines that we're seeing socially, especially in the US right now, around, you've got your personal futures, and then you've got social futures, and you've got the intersections between those, and the question of what kind of future will I get to have, what kind of future will be possible for me. I find that whenever I write explicitly queer stories, and by that I mean like stories where I could show it to a person who doesn't like thinking about queer people, and they would have no choice but to acknowledge that there's queerness in it. I find that in those stories, time becomes a luxury. I find myself very much feeling this sense of hurry because there's not going to be very much time to tell the story, because, you know, for queer people, so often it feels like time is running out, and like the present that I'm in, where I get to exist, might not exist anymore. So I've got to cram all the story in as fast as I can. And I really love stretching out in those stories and imagining, okay, I get to be in the timeline where this story can take as much time as it needs.
Kind of interesting. I will say that I have not thought about like trans narratives and how they before. Now I'm thinking about it and I was just like, oh, that's actually kind of brilliant. So I was like thinking about my work, The Black Tides of Heaven, which is interesting in terms of like, it's the most, I think, trans narrative that I like, explicitly trans narrative that I've written, and that the protagonist, Akeha, goes from like sort of realizing that their gender identity doesn't have to be tied to what expectations their family has for them. And I think like I jumped through time a lot in that narrative, partly because I was trying to condense like, you know, like 30 years into the size of like a book that, like, you know, you can hold in the palm of your hand without any pain. But yeah, the more I think about it, I think like the part unconsciously, part of the reason why I did that was also to sort of like chart out this trans narrative in terms of like the different stages in this person's life as they come to terms with their identity as they go along. So I think, yeah, it's interesting because like, especially in the society that we have set up now, I think like most people's sort of like trans narratives are ones of like passage through time, where there's like there's a distinct before and after like the transformation, like whether like it's a realization, a coming out, or like sort of like coming to terms with the identity. And I think I actually thought about this aspect of trans. Now I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I need to think about this some more. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'll jump in, I guess. I mean, I think that, you know, I definitely have played a lot with the passage of time and like the notion of like memory and how we think about the future in my work. And I'd never thought of that as a specifically trans concern, but now that I think about it, you know, I think that there's something to that. I also think that when you transition, your relationship to time inevitably is kind of altered because you are rewriting your past a little bit. Your past self becomes kind of an extension of the person you're becoming, if that makes any sense. Like when I think about things that I did, like when I was much younger before I transitioned, I don't think of like me as having been a, you know, in a male persona back then. I just think of it as having been me. And so like if I actually had like to draw a mental image of like a scene from like my early 20s, I would draw me as I am now in a way. I would project myself into the past. And I also think that I think about the future really differently as a kind of becoming, as a the process. Like you never really stop becoming the person you want to become. Like even once your transition is finished, allegedly, you're still kind of like trying to find that like better version of yourself. So I think that, you know, transitioning just gives you a different way of thinking about the future as well. So it makes sense on a kind of like a gut level to me that you would have a different relationship to time in storytelling if you're trans, or if you're thinking about trans themes with a Z. I don't know.
It's lovely, Charlie Jane. And thank you so much for that too, because I know one of the things that we had been discussing briefly in our email thread before this evening was the idea of futurity that exists without reflexive condescension towards the present. And the idea of incorporating thoughts about yourself as you are becoming into a past version of yourself as an act of sort of generosity towards multiple versions of yourself strikes me as something that really fits in with what we've been talking about, which is like, what are possible transrelations to time that have to do with generosity or excitement or possibility and expansiveness. So thank you so much for that. I want to keep an eye on time because I know the time is short, and so we'll be turning to audience questions. So I'll move us ahead a little bit. We've been tasked sort of with discussing, you know, again in the sort of core materials, we've been tasked with discussing fluidity of gender, parentheses, or lack thereof. So I just wanted to give you all the opportunity to pick a side. Who wants to take fluidity of gender and who wants to take lack thereof? And then, play dodgeball, defend your position.
I got wrenches. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm on team fluidity 100%. I'm on team abolish taxonomies and dedication to singular identities and just like go wherever you're going to go. And part of that is driven by my intense fatigue with people being like, wait a minute, but that's different from the thing that you said about yourself last time I saw you. And I'm like, yeah, stuff changes. And I think that it's cool that stuff changes and I like it. That's my scholarly take.
Stuff changes, we change, future changes. That's part of the future existing.
Thank God you agree with me because you got wrenches.
I know. But all wrenches aside, I'm on team fluidity as far as like, let's go with the process. Let's go with the program. Let's move. Let's see what's coming up next. So
I'm always the gremlin who's like, why not both? Because like, I think like I lean more team fluidity, but I'm also someone who's just like, I don't want gender, I just want to be void. So I'm like both fluidity. I feel like not having gender is compatible with fluidity of gender. So I'm just like, why not both? They're a Venn diagram.
Yeah, I was going to say why not both and other and everything else. I'm also wondering, and I say this because I am somewhat tied to my gender, and I feel that it makes me who I am. So I'm not going to. I mean, in that sense, it makes me somewhat. Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but I don't know if it makes me binary or not, like, because I am very tied to being femme, right? But I'm wondering also, is it different to say abolish gender or as opposed to abolish the strictures that define gender? I don't know. I mean, for me personally, it's part of who I am to say that my gender is here, as opposed to being more expansive about it. So it is somewhat precious to me. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all always reinventing ourselves, and I think that I'm very I'm personally invested in gender fluidity. Like, I think that I've experimented with identifying gender fluid on and off over the last 20 years, and in this young adult trilogy I'm doing, just slight digression, there's a thing where the universal translator makes it so that you cannot be misgendered, so that when somebody when you meet someone, you know their correct pronoun and you will never use the incorrect pronoun for them. And if you try to use the incorrect pronoun, the translator will just fix it before anybody else hears it. So it's literally impossible to misgender another person. And in the second book of the trilogy, I was just like, well, okay, this one character is just going to use this to set a new pronoun for themselves every day, depending on how they're feeling. And everybody's going to use the correct pronoun for them, for him/her/them on any given day without any difficulty whatsoever, because it's advanced alien society, we can do that. And so it's actually been a lot of fun playing with that in this book. And I showed it to a bunch of people who have experience with gender fluidity to make sure I wasn't totally kicking myself in the face. And but it's been really fun. It's been really fun to write that. And I think that kind of experiment where you're what if we could just if I could have that, I probably would be okay, today my pronoun is blah, because if I knew that everybody would get with the program, I would probably do that for sure. But I know that in real life I'd be misgendered all the time, and so I don't know.
I mean, I think that sounds so cool and so freeing. A conversation that I often have with people who, someone will be like, I've thought my whole life I'm cisgender. I think I might want to try out this new pronoun, but I don't know if I'm allowed. And I wish that conversation could evaporate, because there wouldn't have to be this feeling like you're committing to something forever, that people are going to be mad at you if you decide it doesn't suit you, or if you shift to something different later on in life because you're being in some way inconsistent. I think it would be so great if you could say, I'm going to experiment and I'm going to play, and when I find the thing that feels good, that's what I'm going to do. And if it stops feeling good, I can stop doing it. I'm pro people being the things that make them most happy, and also being free to, I don't know, try stuff. We should try stuff.
That's what I said in high school, and it got me in a lot of trouble, Sarah. Just reminder. Sorry.
I just laughed so loud that Zoom reminded me that I'm muted.
Yeah, this takes us into our last question, which is fairly brief, and then we'll be ready for some audience questions. Yeah, I suppose part of the question there is, do you hear something, does one hear something like fluidity of gender and think of expansiveness and opportunity, or of restraint and restriction? And then the sort of greater question is, can fluidity always incorporate and encompass transness, or can you see some potential for tension between the two? So I suppose it's a question of whether or not you can, or you ought to, distinguish between fluidity and freedom, and whether or not you see that tension, whether you think that tension might be productive, whether it might be challenging, whether it might be damaging. It's a very open-ended question. So feel free, if you have no thoughts about fluidity any longer, to simply share something exciting about your work that you've got coming up and ignore the question altogether.
I just keep wanting to make a pun about futurity. That's all I've got.
Charlie, I hope you're proud of yourself.
Charlie.
I am so proud. I am so proud.
We are very serious here. I think everybody feels almost the same way, that it incorporates transness, it isn't. It depends who it applies to and what it's for, what narrative, what story direction, what are we doing? Where is it? What are we trying to get to as the outcome, the resolve, the conclusion? I don't think there's any one right way to answer it or not. I think everybody has like their own ideals behind it. Distinguishing that freedom within my own work is that it's just freeing for myself personally, as far as being able to explore myself more and being able to come to terms with things that I'm never going to change, and that I don't need to. And some people do need to, and some people do need to come to terms with themselves still. So they're actively working through it by either reading and processing the material that they have before them, or by making it up as they go along. Thus, what we are, writers, right? So, therefore, it's kind of just coming to this point now where I feel like there shouldn't be any tension, but if there is, it's going to be sexy villain on villain tension. And that's what I'm like most here for or invested in. I think it's a freedom and an act of creation and imagination that has kind of been denied for a very long time to finally have its main stage. So, therefore, why would we want to deny it in any aspect or give it a reversal and refuse it from being able to continue to grow and to take over the narrative as it was truly meant to be? So, I think, as far as like, not speaking for everyone, not speaking for all Blackness, just speaking for me, I'm really damn excited. It's like as exciting as like Little Nas's Montero video. It's just gonna drop and we're all gonna go to hell together on like a pole, and Satan's already dead because Nas killed him. But like the future, I feel, is a lot more bold. It's a lot more unafraid, and it doesn't have to have like the same amount of pain that comes with it. That's the only sold narrative. Instead, it is fantasy, sci-fantasy, fiction, Western, what name you for the genre, but mostly science fiction. We're supposed to be the ones who are allowing these narratives to already have existed so that everybody else is playing catch up with us. And that's where I feel like we kind of have the advantage as far as creating the stories that we create and telling the narratives that we do that include transness, fluidity and transness at the same time. Like, wow, oh my God, both a fluid character and a trans character, both in the same book. Wow. Like it's no longer mind-blowing. Life is changing really quickly, and with the advantage of indie publishing and mainstream publishing, we have to have both. Even there, while there's still friction and there's still potential tension as well, it is still growing and it's still becoming our future as of this moment.
I was just going to say, I was also maybe just speaking for myself. I don't know how much of an opinion I can offer in terms of fluidity because I don't consider myself to be terribly fluid. You know, I think when I was coming out as trans, what I was fighting for myself was stability, you know, a kind of concreteness, because I wanted people to use the right pronouns for me. And that was very specific and very kind of binary, right? And so having gotten to a place in my life where people do use the right pronouns, I sort of cling to that sense of stability as opposed to fluidity for myself, you know, and that's who I am. And that I don't think that gives me any way to talk about what it means to be fluid in terms of gender, you know. I think I'll tell my story in terms of its asymptotic approximation of stability. But I'm down with fluidity. I don't know how much I can offer in terms of exploring it, I guess.
Anyone who has talked to me within like the last year has heard me go on endlessly about Lulu Miller's recent book, Why Fish Don't Exist, with which I am profoundly obsessed, and which very much is about the comfort and stability to be found in taxonomy, and the way that exists at the same time as the freedom to be found in releasing oneself from taxonomy. And I just think about it constantly when I think about queerness, the way that we have really exploded in our use of labels and terminology is just over my lifetime. There's so much language to describe and define queerness now that didn't exist when I was a kid. And I'm sure that in 10 years, I'm going to be like using flashcards to try and memorize new queer vocab that younger queers are coming up with, and how freeing and stabilizing that can be for people to say, here's a word that is the thing that I am that I never had before. And then also at the exact same time, how there's people who say, oh, these words feel really limiting and confining, and I'm not comfortable with them. And I mean, how like French ennui voice, how like queers to be like, we want to have a world that can encompass both of these things. I think that's really beautiful of us.
I realize that we are a little bit over time, so I will take us to audience questions if everyone's ready. And hopefully, Neon, I know you were having a little trouble with your headphones, so hopefully if that's working out. If you'd like to go first next, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for bearing with us with difficult headphones. So somebody in the audience just had a sort of lovely question just about, do any of you find that you enjoy sort of toying with the meaning or the signifiers of clothing in any of your work, since they can often be so heavily gendered? Same with haircuts. Those were the sort of two things that somebody would have wanted to ask about. So clothes and haircuts, you write about them? What do you think? What's fun? Play with it.
Yeah, I write about them. Who doesn't? I live them. Oh my God. if all my hair wasn't gone right now, you could see all the huge 17-inch glory my afro just was. But I just cut it all off because I finished a project, and I do that with every celebration of a project being over. However, in comics, we get to have a little bit more fun, I feel, as far as, oh my God, I really just watched this really dope runway. Can you draw the whole thing? No, can we go ahead and incorporate that into the book in some way without plagiarizing it? And I feel that also people have nicknamed haircuts like the bisexual, which is like one side shaved, usually in comics. And then there's the full homosexual, which is both your sides shaved. And then there's the skullet, which means that you're a badass manic pixie dream kid. And then there's like various other forms of like how you would like to do your hair. And I feel that our hair is like just as much of a freeing point of ourselves, a point of reference. When I had very cotton candy blue hair, my wife couldn't lose me in a crowd, which is great because she's also 5'11" and I'm only 5'1", so I can get lost very easily. But back on track, hair extension of ourselves, our body, our clothes, they are meant to be markers of who we truly like to be. If we're fluid, we're going in and out of styles. If we're trans, we're usually trying to conform or not conform to what the identity of our real self, true self is. So it's something that for everybody it's different, and it's so much fun to work with in comics, animation, and visual impacted media. And that's not to discredit prose at all, because a lot of those, whenever they're adapted to those forms, those things are literally on the mood board when they're being presented to the writers, the adaptation team, various other points, because just like our faces make us, so does our fashion. And I have a lot of feelings about fashion because I feel like there's so many incredible things that are pushing it forward. There's a lot of call for gender neutrality in clothing, especially in the high fashion world now. Um, I don't need that, because like fashion is fashion. Everyone should be able to wear it. So it doesn't really need limiters. It needs breakers to just kind of be like, yeah, wear whatever makes you happy and have a good day.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly that that character I mentioned, because I just got done editing this novel, so I apologize, it's on my mind, but that character I mentioned, the one who uses the universal translator to have a different pronoun on different days, and everybody just respects his/her/their pronoun, no matter what. There's a part where they get a makeover from another character. They get given this like special kind of nanotech makeup that you can like make it appear and disappear by like touching your cheekbones, like boop, boop, like you're wearing makeup, you're not wearing makeup. And at some point in the story, she switches from female pronouns to male pronouns, but decides to keep the makeup on because it looks so good. And because it's just, he wants to be, now that he's using he, him pronouns, he wants to be like a beautiful femme guy. And I was just like, that's the future I want.
I was, excuse me, I was going to say clothes and hair play play a big part in my comics. Not only in terms of like signaling a kind of queerness or transness, but also investigating what it means to be a South Asian trans person, you know? So I think there's a lot of work in Apsara Engine where I paid attention to the clothes people wearing, and in some cases they talk about the clothes that they're wearing as signals of their cultural inheritance, right? And this is also something that I was investigating, which is a funny way to put it, but rediscovering, let's say, as I became trans, was like what it meant to be Indian, and what it meant to wear clothes that signaled to the world that this is the place that I was coming from, both in terms of gender and in terms of culture. And also in my other book, Spellbound, there's quite a bit of discussion about being goth, which has always been very important to me. I'm an old goth auntie now, but it kind of informed who I was as I evolved. And so, yeah, that sense of like clothing and hair as a kind of, as both shield and a kind of weapon, and I don't want to use the word weapon, but it's all that comes to mind right now, is at the kind of very much at the forefront of a lot of the comics that I work on.
As the least fashionable Black kid that I know, I love you and appreciate you for that. I still have, I feel like uh, uh, a mixed relationship with fashion. I feel like I have more fun with it on my characters and more fun with it in my fantasy and my science fiction than I get to with my own body sometimes. And I feel like being able to push that a little bit forward and to be able to still find a point where I'm comfortable with it is something that's always going to be a growth in progress for me. But as far as my work is concerned, it never really is. It's always just something I already have set because it's all the things I would like to wear, but I stick on other people.
So I actually wanted to follow up a little bit on like what something Bishakh touched upon, and that was actually the first thing I thought about when the question was asked about hair, because for me, like gender and like and markers that determine gender are also very cultural, because like in terms of like the current Western standard of like guys have short hair, women have long hair, that kind of thing. That's not a universal, that's not like a universal marker of gender. And I think about it because like in a lot of like East Asian cultures, like men did not have short hair until like, Western influences came into play. So like, I think that's the thing that I also think about when I write, especially if I'm like putting things in a specifically like non-Western setting, that like the way that gender markers in terms of like clothing and hair, the way that it's expressed is going to be different from what people normally think of as gender markers in the West. So I mean, like that's an interesting thing that also affects how I approach like character design and things like that as well. So yeah, that I just want to bring it up because that was the first thing I thought about when we started talking about like, clothes and hair in terms of like in terms of gender and writing.
We do have time for one more quick answer before it turns 9, and we need to start wrapping this up if anyone has just a minute or two of final thoughts.
Okay.
They're not mandatory, and I won't make you all suffer in silence. So instead, I will simply thank all of you so much for your time and your thoughts this evening. This has just been lovely and invigorating, and I'm so pleased that I was able to be here and listen to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for wrangling us all.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for the super thought-provoking questions. You're awesome. This was so much fun. This is giving me a lot to think about, so I really appreciate it. And so lovely to hang out with y'all.
And of course, thank you to the Strand.
ASL. And thanks to Pro Bono ASL. Y'all are just amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, y'all are doing an amazing job.
So final thank yous again. I will echo everyone. Thank you, our Pro Bono ASL interpreters this evening for joining us. Thank you, our entire wonderful, I already ran out of words, wonderful, thought-provoking panelists for joining us. Thank you, our wonderful moderator, for joining us. I appreciate all of you being here. I want to also thank our lovely audience for joining us as well, from every corner of the globe, for celebrating this really special day. If you haven't already, our links to purchase the titles for our authors are in the chat. And is there anything our panel, our lineup would like to say to our audience as a final parting words before we sign off for the night?
Yes. Attention all Black viewers, attention all brown kid viewers, attention all creators of color. This is Tanika Stotts here giving you a brief message. Continue to kick ass, continue to create, continue to elevate. Don't ever let anybody tell you no. And if they do, just continue to keep going. There is nothing in this world that is stopping us from continuing to grow into the people that we want to be. Anyway, I love you all, and that's what we're here to do.
You're all wonderful. Oh, sorry. Anything else? Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us. Stay safe out there, wear a mask, wash your hands, don't touch anything you're not supposed to, and we'll see you at our next Strand event. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye everyone.